Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a mission, really, to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from a whole stack of sources. And it's all about something that impacts every single one of us, whether you're interested or not. Money.
Right. It's unavoidable.
Exactly. And here's the core idea we're exploring. Doing well with money, it has surprisingly little to do with how smart you are, like raw IQ. It's got a whole lot more to do with your behavior, which, often catches people off guard.
Yeah, because finance is usually taught like a math class, right?
Yeah.
Full of formulas, precise calculations, hard science.
Precisely. So to really set the stage for why behavior is just so crucial, let me tell you two incredible, kind of contrasting stories from our sources. First, picture this wildly successful tech executive, certified genius, really.
Okay.
Designed and patented a key Wi-Fi component in his 20s, started and sold several companies, just, off the charts successful. But our sources reveal his relationship with money was, well, a mess, a mix of insecurity and, frankly, some really childish stupidity.
Oh, wow.
Like carrying thick stacks of $100 bills, bragging loudly about his wealth. And get this, once he bought several $1,000 gold coins and, with his buddies, threw them into the Pacific Ocean.
Threw them?
Yeah, just for fun, like skipping rock.
You're kidding. $1,000 a pop.
$1,000 a pop. And you might wonder how long that could possibly last. Well, not long. He ended up completely broke.
Wow. Okay, that's one extreme.
Now, contrast that with Ronald Reed, a humble janitor and gas station attendant from rural Vermont, first in his family to graduate high school, bought a modest little house for $12,000 back when he was 38, lived there his whole life.
Okay, very different picture.
Very different. When he died in 2014, aged 92, fewer than 4,000 Americans had a net worth over $8 million. Ronald Reed was one of them.
The janitor. Seriously, how?
No lottery win, no big inheritance. He just saved what little he could, consistently, and invested in blue chip stocks, the big stable companies, and then he just waited.
For how long?
Decades. Decades upon decades, and those tiny savings just compounded into more than $8 million.
$8 million?
Yeah. He left $2 million to his stepkids, over $6 million to his local hospital and library. So how can these two paths, so vastly different, lead to such opposite outcomes? I mean, what are we missing here?
Well, what's truly fascinating, I think, is how much our psychology, our emotions, and our really deeply personal experiences shape every single financial decision we make. The tech executive story, it just shows a genius completely losing control of his emotions, right? Succumbing to this insatiable ego, leading straight to disaster.
Total disaster.
Whereas Ronald Reed, he highlights that ordinary folks, maybe with a zero formal financial education, can achieve immense wealth just by consistently saving and investing using a handful of simple behavioral skills.
Right.
It really shows us that financial success is less of a hard science, with precise formulas, and much, much more of a soft skill. It's rooted in behavior psychology, not just raw intelligence.
That's such a critical distinction. And it leads us right into our first core concept, which our sources call no one's crazy. The idea being that what might seem totally crazy or irrational to one person about money can seem perfectly sensible to someone else. Why is that?
It's because people are deeply anchored to beliefs formed by their unique experiences. Think about it. Where and when you grew up, your family's values around money, the specific economy you lived through, it all shapes you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's academic research, actually, by Malmendier and Nagel. They looked at 50 years of consumer finances, and they found that people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily influenced by experiences early in their adult life. It's really formative.
So, what kind of experiences?
Well, for example, if you grew up during a period of high inflation, you were much more likely to invest less in bonds later in life, compared to someone who experienced low inflation, right? Because bonds got hammered by inflation.
Okay. So your early experience kind of sets your default view.
Exactly. Bill Gross, the famous bond manager, he admitted his whole career basically coincided perfectly with this generational collapse in interest rates. So to him, bonds looked like wealth-generating machines.
Right, because that's all he'd really known professionally.
But, to his father's generation who lived through higher inflation, those same bonds might have looked like wealth incinerators.
Wow. Same asset, totally different perception.
It's just the dumb luck, really, of when and where you were born. It shapes your baseline.
And here's a surprising fact from the source that really puts this into perspective for me. Many foundational financial tools we just take for granted today, like the 401k retirement plan or the Roth IRA, they're relatively new. The 401k didn't even exist until 1978. The Roth IRA wasn't born until 1998.
Less than 50 years old.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty recent in the grand scheme of things.
It is. So what does this all mean for us today, trying to navigate this complex financial world?
Well, it means we're all kind of newbies, aren't we, in this modern financial system. We're sort of winging it as we go along. We don't have centuries of accumulated relevant experience to draw from for these specific tools.
That's a sobering thought. We're all figuring it out.
Yeah. And to elaborate on that no one's crazy idea, think about lottery tickets. They're mostly bought by lower income households.
Right, which statistically seems like a terrible financial decision.
From a purely rational mathematical standpoint, absolutely. It's a bad bet. Yet for those struggling financially, our sources point out something interesting. Buying that ticket is often, and I quote, the only time in our lives we can hold a tangible dream of escaping their current situation.
Tangible dream. That reframes it.
Exactly. You don't have to agree with the logic, you don't have to condone it financially, but understanding that differing perspective helps us see people's decisions aren't just about spreadsheets. They're often rooted in these deep personal narratives.
Understanding those personal narratives is so important. And that brings us neatly to our next big idea: the inseparable twins of luck and risk. Our sources remind us that life outcomes, well, they're often guided by forces way beyond our individual effort. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Indeed. Consider the story of Bill Gates and his friend Kent Evans. It's quite compelling. Bill Gates had what our sources call 1 in a million luck. Why? He attended one of the only high schools in the world with a computer back in 1968.
Wow, one of the only ones. That is lucky.
Incredibly rare. It let him spend countless hours learning to program. But his friend, Ken Evans, equally skilled, equally ambitious, someone Gates thought could have been a founding partner of Microsoft.
Yeah. What happened?
He died in a 1 in a million risk mountaineering accident before he even graduated high school.
Oh my gosh.
Same magnitude of force, right? Luck and risk, just working in opposite directions. It shows outcomes aren't solely dictated by effort or skill.
That's a stark reminder, isn't it? The unpredictable nature of it all. And it's challenging because quantifying luck and risk is just incredibly difficult. Maybe impossible.
It really is.
And that's probably why we struggle to acknowledge their role, in our own success, or when we judge others. We prefer simple stories. Effort leads to outcome.
Exactly. Clean narratives.
Our sources point to historical examples like Cornelius Vanderbilt or John D. Rockefeller. Their huge successes were often tied to actions that, well, they really blurred the line between bold and reckless. Vanderbilt once said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?"
Yeah.
He was wildly successful, but
Yeah, you look back and think, was that genius or just incredibly risky and he got away with it?
precisely. Hindsight makes that line seem much thinner than it probably felt at the time. Was it supreme shrewdness or just a lucky break? Hard to tell.
And that leads to a really crucial takeaway from the sources. Success is a lousy teacher.
Yeah.
It can seduce smart people into thinking they can't lose, making them feel invincible, overconfident.
Right, because they attribute it all to skill, not luck.
Exactly. And conversely, failure can be a lousy teacher, too. It can make you think your decisions were terrible when sometimes it was just the unforgiving reality of risk playing out.
So you might abandon a good strategy just because of bad luck.
Precisely. The lesson here is maybe focus less on those extreme individual case studies, the billionaires, the spectacular failures. They're often outliers driven by extreme luck or risk. It's better to look for broad, repeatable patterns for learning. Those are more applicable to your own life.
That makes a lot of sense. Focus on the patterns, not the outliers. Okay, speaking of outcomes, that brings us to the dangers of never enough. John Bogle, the Vanguard founder, shared this really powerful anecdote. It was at a party given by a billionaire. Kurt Vonnegut tells his friend Joseph Heller, the author.
Catch-22, right.
Right. Vonnegut says their host, the billionaire, made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from Catch-22 over its entire history.
Wow. Okay. And Heller's response?
Heller responds, so profoundly, so simply, yes, but I have something he will never have, enough.
Enough. Wow. That one word just hangs there, doesn't it? It's incredibly powerful and so often overlooked in the relentless pursuit of more wealth.
Totally.
Our sources really illustrate the danger of this insatiable appetite for more. They use the stories of Rajat Gupta, the former McKinsey CEO, worth $100 million, an unimaginable sum for most people.
Absolutely. life-changing money multiple times over.
Yet he wanted billionaire circle wealth. He craved more. And he went to prison for insider trading to get it.
Risked everything he had and needed for something he didn't need.
Exactly. And then there's Bernie Madoff, obviously, swindled investors for decades, driven by that same insatiable desire. Warren Buffett, reflecting on the collapse of long-term capital management, that hedge fund, he put it perfectly. To make money they didn't have and didn't need, they risked what they did have and did need. And that's foolish. Simple as that.
That quote really hits home for me. It truly highlights what our sources call the hardest financial skill: getting the goalpost to stop moving.
It is so hard.
They explain how social comparison, constantly looking at what others have, keeping up with the Joneses, it just creates this never-ending battle. The ceiling of social comparison is so high, virtually no one will ever hit it. So how do you even begin to win a battle that you fundamentally cannot win?
Yeah, it's unwinnable by definition. Our sources suggest the only way to win is, well, to not fight in the first place. To accept that you might have enough, even if it's less than those around you seem to have.
Easier said than done, though?
Oh, absolutely. But enough isn't about having too little. It's about recognizing that the insatiable desire for more, that constant comparison, it eventually pushes you to the point of regret. The source emphasizes these invaluable things that should never be risked, no matter the potential gain.
Like what?
Your reputation, your freedom and independence, your family, your friends, your happiness. Knowing when you have enough is probably your best shot at keeping hold of those things.
Knowing when to stop chasing more, that's profound. And it connects beautifully to our next concept, the power of compounding. Our sources unpack this confounding compounding, as they call it, using an analogy I loved. Ice ages.
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
They explain it's not necessarily the sheer amount of snow each winter that causes ice sheets. It's the fact that snow, however little, lasts. It doesn't melt in the summer.
Right. Small, consistent accumulations over vast periods.
Exactly. Leading to these colossal results. Can you give us another example that really drives this home? Because it's hard to grasp intuitively.
Absolutely. Let's talk Warren Buffett again. His net worth is often cited, maybe $84.5 billion or so. But here's the truly astonishing part. An incredible $84.2 billion of that was accumulated after his 50th birthday.
Wait, say that again. Almost all of it.
Almost all. And get this. A mind-blowing $81.5 billion came after he qualified for Social Security in his mid-60s.
That's unbelievable.
His success isn't just about being a good investor, though he clearly is. It's about being a good investor for 3/4 of a century.
Okay, so the time component is massive.
It's almost everything. Think about this thought experiment from the source. If Buffett had started investing in his 30s, like a normal person, and retired in his 60s, also pretty normal, his net worth today, it would be 99.9% less than it actually is.
99.9% less, just from starting later and stopping earlier.
Yeah. His real secret isn't just stock picking, it's time. Decades and decades of compounding.
That statistic genuinely blows my mind. Why do you think our brains struggle so much with grasping this kind of exponential growth?
Well, linear thinking is just so much more intuitive, isn't it? We can easily picture 8 + 8 + 8.
Right, that's 24.
Simple, but 8 by 8 by 8, that's 512. Our intuition just doesn't grasp that leap easily. It's a cognitive bias.
We underestimate it.
Massively. Exponential growth isn't how most things in our everyday world work. Our sources give another great example with hard drive storage. From a few dozen megabytes in the 60s to, 100 terabytes today, it just exploded.
Right. Or Bill Gates, back in 2004. Even he, Mr. Tech himself, criticized Gmail, offering a gigabyte of storage.
Yeah, he was like, why would anyone need that much? He couldn't quite grasp the exponential trajectory even in his own field.
Fascinating.
So the ultimate conclusion here is that good investing isn't necessarily about earning the highest returns. Those often come from crazy risks, one-off hits you can't repeat. It's about earning pretty good returns that you can stick with and which can be repeated for the longest period of time.
Consistency and time.
That's when compounding really runs wild and creates that extraordinary wealth.
That's a crucial distinction. And it leads us to another key concept: getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Our sources argue these require two very different skill sets.
Very different, almost opposites in some ways.
Getting money often requires taking risks, being optimistic, putting yourself out there, but keeping it, that requires the opposite.
Yeah.
Humility, maybe even a bit of fear or paranoia, and definitely frugality.
Yeah, the mindset shifts entirely.
The source shares this stark contrast. Jesse Livermore made the equivalent of over $3 billion, inflation adjusted, in the 1929 crash. Genius trader.
Made a fortune when everyone else was losing their shirts.
Exactly. But just 4 years later, he'd lost everything. And eventually, tragically, took his own life. Then there's Abraham Germansky, another multimillionaire totally ruined by the same crash.
So they were brilliant at getting wealthy.
Brilliant, but terrible at staying wealthy. They couldn't hold on to it.
That's such a powerful and, tragic lesson in the importance of endurance. Survival. Michael Moritz, the billionaire head of Sequoia Capital, the big VC firm, he attributes their decades of success not to being the smartest or fastest.
They know of them.
He says it's because they're always being afraid of going out of business, that survival mentality is key.
Always afraid, even at the top.
Especially at the top, maybe. Our sources outline 3 essential applications of this survival mindset for personal finance. First, financial unbreakability. This means prioritizing being financially unbreakable over just chasing the absolute biggest returns.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
It might mean holding more cash than feels optimal, even during a bull market when stocks are soaring. Seems conservative, maybe even inefficient.
Right, you feel like you're missing out.
You do. But if that cash prevents you from being forced to sell your stocks at a huge loss during a bear market, maybe because you lost your job or had an emergency, well, the long-term return on not being forced to sell can be immense. It lets compounding keep working because you survived.
Survival enables compounding. Got it. What's next?
Second, planning for the unforeseen. Our sources emphasize that the most important part of any plan is, kind of ironically, to plan on the plan not going according to plan.
Huh. Okay, embracing uncertainty.
Totally. Think about huge unexpected events. 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID pandemic. Nobody predicted those with any precision. A good plan accepts this uncertainty and builds in room for error.
Room for error. How do you build that in?
It could be a frugal budget, flexible thinking about your career, a loose timeline for your goals. Anything that lets you live happily with a range of outcomes, not just one specific path.
Flexibility. Okay, and the third application.
And third, what the source calls a barbelled personality. This is a mindset, really. It allows you to be genuinely optimistic about the long-term future, believing things will generally get better, economies will grow,
Okay, long-term optimism.
while simultaneously being paranoid about the short-term disasters, the landmines that could blow you up and prevent you from reaching that long-term future.
Optimistic and paranoid at the same time. That sounds tricky.
It is hard, but think about the U.S. economy. Over 170 years, immense growth overall, incredible progress. But along the way, 9 major wars killing 1.3 million Americans, 33 recessions lasting a cumulative 48 years, stock market crashes, pandemics, natural disasters.
Yeah, it hasn't exactly been a smooth ride.
Not at all. So you need that long-term optimism to invest for growth, but that short-term paranoia to make sure you survive the inevitable bumps along the way.
Survival is everything. It keeps coming back to that. And part of survival maybe is understanding that failure is actually a normal part of the process. Which leads us to our next big idea. Tails, you win.
Right. The power of outliers.
This concept explains how a small number of events, those long tails on the distribution curve, account for the vast majority of outcomes, especially in finance and business. What's fascinating here is how often things go wrong or just kind of flatline, and yet success still emerges because of these few massive wins.
That's exactly right. Think about Heinz Berggren, the art dealer who fled Nazi Germany. Our sources suggest he was probably wrong, maybe 99% of the time, on the art he acquired, didn't appreciate, went nowhere.
99% wrong. That sounds like a terrible track record.
It does, but it didn't really matter, because the other 1%, well, some of those turned out to be Picasso's Matisses. Huge, huge wins that paid for all the mistakes many times over.
The tail wags the dog.
Precisely. Or Walt Disney. Produced over 400 cartoons early in his career, most of them lost money. The studio was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. Until Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1938. It was a gigantic hit. Paid off all the company's debts, built a new studio, totally transformed everything. One massive tail event.
Wow. And this applies beyond art and movies.
Oh, absolutely. Venture capital is a classic example. Data shows maybe 65% of VC investments lose money or barely break even.
That's a lot of failures.
It is, but a tiny fraction, maybe 0.5%, return 50 times the initial investment or more. Those few massive successes drive the entire industry's returns.
Okay, so it's not about being right all the time.
Not at all. Even in the broad stock market, like the Russell 3000 index. Over the long run, something like 40% of the companies in the index effectively failed, lost almost all their value.
40%.
Yeah. But a mere 7% of the companies drove all the index's overall positive return since 1980. The winners win big enough to cover all the losers and then some.
It's astonishing when you see the numbers laid out like that. So how does this connect to personal investing for, regular people?
Well, our sources emphasize that your ultimate success as an investor is likely determined not by the years of smooth sailing, but by how you respond during those brief, intense moments of sheer terror.
Like the 2008 crisis.
Exactly. Think about how you behaved, what you did or didn't do during those few months in late 2008 and early 2009. That probably had more impact on your lifetime returns than everything you did in the 8 years before that.
Because that's when people panic and sell at the bottom.
Precisely. The source quotes Napoleon, actually. A military genius is the man who can do the average thing when all those around him are going crazy.
Huh. So the investing genius is just the man or woman who can stick to their plan when everyone else is freaking out.
Pretty much. Doing the average, sensible thing like rebalancing or just holding on when emotions are running wild, that's the real skill. This whole tails mindset means embracing that it's normal for a lot of things to fail or underperform as long as the few successes you have are massive enough. Jeff Bezos, after Amazon's Fire Phone, completely bombed a huge public failure.
Yeah, I remember that.
He famously said, "If you think that's a big failure, we're working on much bigger failures right now."
Wow. Okay, so he understood the model.
Yeah.
You need to take big swings.
Exactly. He was acknowledging the power of tails. You have to accept the possibility of big failures to find those game-changing successes. Even Buffett himself stated he's owned maybe 400 or 500 stocks in his life. He made most of his money on just 10 of them.
Only 10 out of hundreds.
Yeah. The lesson isn't whether you're right or wrong more often. What matters is how much money you make when you are right and how much you lose when you're wrong. The magnitude matters more than the frequency.
Okay, that's a really important perspective shift. With all this talk of wealth and investing, though, it's worth asking, what is the ultimate purpose of it all? Our sources shift focus here to what they call the highest form of wealth. And it's not a dollar amount.
No, it's not.
It's the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. It's about control.
Yes. Freedom. Control over your time. Psychologist Angus Campbell did research back in the 80s looking at what actually makes people happy. And he found that having a strong sense of controlling one's life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any of the objective conditions of life.
More dependable than salary, or house size, or job title.
More dependable than any of those objective things. That feeling of control over what you do, when you do it, and with whom you do it. That's the biggest driver of happiness. So, money's greatest intrinsic value, which really can't be overstated, is its ability to give you control over your time.
That makes so much intuitive sense, and it resonates deeply with me personally. Think about it in practical terms. Even a small amount of wealth means you can take a few sick days without stressing about the lost pay.
Right. Basic security.
A bit more means maybe waiting for a better job after a layoff, instead of desperately grabbing the first thing that comes along. More still means maybe the flexibility to take a lower-paying job, but one with, say, shorter hours or more meaning. Or handling a medical emergency without financial panic.
Freedom to make choices aligned with your values, not just your immediate financial needs.
Exactly. The author of our sources shares their own experience leaving a high-paying investment banking job. They actually loved the work itself.
Okay, so why leave?
Because the lack of control over their time, the brutal hours, the unpredictability made a job they loved feel miserable.
That's a key insight. Doing something you love on a schedule you can't control can feel just as bad as doing something you hate.
It really can. And it points to this paradox of modern life, doesn't it?
Which is?
The U.S., for example, was way richer than it was in the 1950s. Median family income, adjusted for inflation, has more than doubled.
Right. We have way more stuff, bigger houses, more technology.
But is there any evidence that Americans are, on average, happier today than they were in the 1950s?
Not really, no. The happiness surveys are surprisingly flat.
So what happened? We got richer, bought more stuff, but didn't get happier.
Well, part of what happened, the sources argue, is that while we gained wealth, we simultaneously gave up more control over our time, especially with the rise of thought-based jobs. Your work is in your head, so it feels like it's always with you, the boundaries blurred.
Right. The phone is always on, email never stops.
Exactly. And that loss of control cancels out some of the potential happiness gains from the increased wealth.
Hmm.
We traded time autonomy for more consumption.
That's a sobering trade-off.
It is. There was this gerontologist, Carl Pilmer, who interviewed 1,000 elderly Americans for their most important life lessons.
Now, what did they say looking back?
Not a single person said that to be happy, you should work as hard as possible to make money to buy more things. Not one. Nobody said you should try to be wealthier than your neighbors.
So what do they value?
They valued quality friendships and spending quality, unstructured time with their children and families. Time in relationships, not stuff.
Time and relationships. That's powerful. And it brings us to another fascinating paradox highlighted in the sources. Wealth is what you don't see.
Ah, yes, the hidden nature of wealth.
This connects to what they call the man in the car paradox. It goes like this. When you see someone driving a really nice car, say a Ferrari,
Okay.
you rarely think, wow, the person driving that car must be really cool. Do you?
Ha ha ha. No, probably not.
Instead, you think, wow, if I had that car, people would think I'm cool. You use it as a benchmark for your own desires.
Right. You admire the car and imagine yourself in it, getting admiration. You don't really admire the driver.
Exactly. People want wealth to signal admiration from others, but others are usually too busy focusing on their own desires and aspirations to actually give that admiration. It's a fundamental disconnect.
It's a great paradox, and it points to the fact that true wealth is what you don't see. It's the nice cars not purchased, the diamonds not bought, the first-class upgrade declined. It's income that is not spent.
So rich is different from wealthy.
Very different, according to the source. Rich is a current income. Someone driving a $100,000 car is almost certainly rich. They have high income. But the only data point you really have about their wealth is that they now have $100,000 less than they did before they bought the car, or $100,000 more debt.
No. Right.
Wealth is hidden, it's income not spent, it's financial assets that haven't yet been converted into the stuff you see. It's an option, flexibility.
It reminds me of that funny but true story about Rihanna's financial advisor.
Oh yeah, what was that?
Apparently, her spending got so out of control early in her career that the advisor had to tell her, point blank, was it really necessary to tell her that if you spend money on things, you will end up with the things and not the money?
Wow. Stating the obvious, but sometimes the obvious needs stating. People confuse spending money with being wealthy.
They really do. So if wealth is what you don't spend, then building wealth is ultimately about your savings rate,
Right.
more than your income level or even your investment returns.
That's the argument. Your savings rate is more in your control than those other factors. Income depends on the job market. Returns depend on the wider economy. Savings depends on your spending. Building wealth comes down to efficiency and frugality relative to your income, and that is entirely in your control.
And the biggest obstacle to saving more, the source suggests, isn't necessarily low income, but ego approaching income,
Meaning spending money to show people how much money you have. Caring too much about what others think and trying to signal status through consumption. That's the biggest hurdle to a high savings rate.
letting go of the ego. Okay.
Precisely. And you don't even need a specific goal to save money for. That's another key point.
Really? We're always told to save for something, a house, retirement, a car.
Those are great. But saving just for saving's sake, without a specific target in mind, is equally, maybe even more important. Why? Because it's a hedge against life's inevitable ability to surprise the hell out of you at the worst possible moment.
Huh. Okay. Saving for the unknown unknowns.
Exactly. This kind of saving, this cushion, it offers options and flexibility, the ability to wait, and the opportunity to pounce. The return on that flexibility, being able to change careers, wait for a better investment opportunity, handle an emergency. The source says that return is incalculable.
Incalculable. I like that. It allows you to take a job with more purpose, perhaps, or wait for investment opportunities that only come when other people, those without flexibility, become desperate.
That's the power of just having that buffer.
Such a freeing idea. And it brings us to another key insight our sources dive into. The concept that being reasonable is often better than being strictly rational in finance.
Right. This is a big one.
They challenge you to remember, you're not a spreadsheet. You're a screwed up emotional person. We all are.
Yeah, that resonates. And they use a fascinating historical example. Dr. Ragnar Jareg. He won the Nobel Prize for developing malaria therapy for late-stage syphilis. Basically, he intentionally gave patients malaria to induce extremely high, painful fevers.
Why on earth would he do that?
Because the high fever, though agonizing, actually killed the syphilis bacteria. It was medically rational, it worked.
But for the patient.
Probably not very tolerable. Painful, scary. The point is, we often do what's reasonable and tolerable for us as humans, not necessarily what's purely, coldly rational on paper.
Okay, so how does that apply to finance?
Well, even Harry Markowitz, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for developing modern portfolio theory, the mathematical basis for diversification.
The ultimate rational finance guy, right?
Yeah, you'd think. But when it came to his own retirement portfolio, how did he allocate his money?
How? Did he use his own complex formulas?
Nope. He split it 50-50 between stocks and bonds. Why? He said his goal was to minimize future regret. He wanted a simple approach he could stick with emotionally, not necessarily the one with the absolute highest theoretical return.
He made a reasonable decision for his emotional well-being, not a purely rational one based only on math.
Exactly. It had to be something he could live with.
So it's about finding a strategy you can actually stick with emotionally, through thick and thin. Our sources contrast that with, say, a rational Yale study that suggested young savers should use 2.1 margin on stocks.
Whoa, borrowing money to double down on stocks? That sounds incredibly risky.
It is. The study argued that even if you got wiped out occasionally, statistically, you'd end up better off in the long run by maximizing exposure when young. Purely rational, perhaps.
But could anyone actually do that? Emotionally handle getting wiped out? Probably not.
Right, so the sources contrast that with the more reasonable approach. Find an investment strategy you genuinely believe in, maybe even love, so you can stick with it during the lean years. Because that commitment, that ability to endure fueled by emotional buy-in, is what actually produces the good long-term returns in the real world. Not some theoretical optimum you bail on at the first sign of trouble.
Exactly right. It has to be sustainable for you, the emotional human. Even something like home bias, overweighting stocks from your own country because they feel familiar.
Yeah, technically that's considered irrational diversification.
It is. Or even doing a tiny bit of day trading on the side with play money. Academics hate that stuff. But if having that small, local, or active part helps you stay disciplined and committed to your main, sensible, diversified long-term strategy for the rest of your portfolio,
then maybe it's reasonable, even if not perfectly rational.
Exactly. If it helps you sleep at night and stay the course, it has value. Even Jack Bogle, Mr. Index Fund himself, apparently invested some money in his son's actively managed higher fee fund.
No way. Why?
For family reasons, apparently. It shows that life isn't always perfectly consistent. What's optimal on paper isn't always what's reasonable or right for a human life.
Respecting the messiness of being human. Okay. And speaking of things that aren't always neat and predictable, let's talk about history. Specifically, how history can sometimes be a misleading guide for the future. Stanford professor Scott Sagan had this great quote: "Things that have never happened before happen all the time."
That's a good one. And very relevant to finance.
It's crucial because we rely so much on historical data. But history is not a perfect map of the future, is it?
No, definitely not. This highlights what the source calls the historians as prophets fallacy. We have this tendency to over-rely on past data, especially in a field like finance, where innovation and change are constant.
It's not like physics, right?
Exactly. Physics is governed by immutable laws. Finance is governed by people's behaviors, feelings, fears, greed, and those things evolve. Societies change, technology changes, rules change. Our sources show how just a handful of really big outlier events, things totally unforeseen, have profoundly shaped the world's direction.
Like what kind of events?
Like the end of the Cold War or 9/11. These events had massive compounding and totally unforeseeable consequences across the board. The source even draws a line, maybe controversially, but interestingly, from 9/11 leading to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, huge deficits, the Fed keeping rates low, fueling the housing bubble, eventually contributing to the 2008 crisis and subsequent student loan surge.
Wow, that's quite a chain reaction. Hard to predict that in 2000.
Impossible. But that's how the world works sometimes. Driven by these big, unexpected tail events, history is just one damn thing after another.
And it means past patterns won't always hold. Benjamin Graham's investment formulas, the ones that made him famous in the mid-20th century.
The foundations of value investing.
Right. They were revolutionary then, step-by-step guides to getting rich. But now, they're mostly outdated.
Because things changed. Markets got more efficient, information spread faster, accounting rules evolved.
Exactly. His formulas were discarded and updated multiple times, even during his own life. It demonstrates that the further back you look in finance, the more likely you are to be examining a world that no longer applies to today.
So the correct lesson to learn from surprises, as Daniel Kahneman put it, isn't the specifics of the last surprise.
What is it then?
It's simply that the world is surprising. The most important economic events of the future, the ones that will move the needle the most, are things we aren't talking about today, things that seem unimaginable now.
So again, it comes back to that room for error.
Yes. Embrace humility about our ability to predict. Have a flexible mindset rather than clinging rigidly to precise forecasts based only on the past, because the past doesn't account for structural changes or unprecedented events.
You have to plan for surprise. And one of those surprises, maybe, is how easily we humans are seduced by certain kinds of narratives, especially pessimism. Why is it, as historian Deirdre McCloskey asks, that people like to hear that the world is going to hell? It's odd, but pessimism often sounds smarter, more intellectual, and definitely gets more attention than optimism.
It's absolutely true, isn't it? Think about it. Doom and gloom predictions always get headlines. Remember that Wall Street Journal front page article back in 2008? Some Russian academic, Igor Panarin, predicted the U.S. would break apart into 6 separate pieces by 2010.
Oh yeah, I vaguely remember that. It sounded dramatic.
It did. And it got tons of attention because it was pessimistic and specific. Now contrast that with how absurd a prediction of Japan's actual post-WWII economic boom would have sounded back in 1945. If someone predicted Japan would grow 15 times its size, life expectancy would nearly double, it would become a manufacturing powerhouse. People would have thought they were insane. Optimism often sounds like naive salesmanship.
So there is an inherent bias towards believing bad news. Why?
Well, pessimism is seductive for a few reasons, the sources suggest. 1, money affects everyone, so bad financial news feels universally relevant and threatening. 2, pessimism often requires action. Sell, get out. While optimism is often just stay the course, which feels passive. And 3, progress happens slowly, often imperceptibly, while setbacks happen quickly and grab headlines.
Right, like the Wright brothers' first flight, it was barely reported for years. But a plane crash, that's immediate front-page news. Setbacks are sudden and dramatic.
Exactly. Progress is slow and cumulative. So pessimism just feels more urgent, more intelligent somehow, even though historically the optimists have been right about long-term progress far more often.
And this bias towards certain narratives leads to the danger of what the sources call appealing fictions.
Right. Stories we want to believe.
Especially when we face situations with limited control and high stakes, like investing. We tend to gravitate towards stories that make us feel more in control or promise extreme, easy rewards.
That illusion of control is incredibly persuasive, much more so than embracing the uncomfortable reality of uncertainty and randomness.
It explains why things like Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme worked for so long, right? He offered consistently high, smooth returns, an appealing fiction that seemed to remove risk.
Exactly, or why people still pay for complex, unproven investment advice or market timing systems. They're selling a story of control in an inherently uncertain domain.
Investing offers these daily opportunities for potentially extreme rewards,
Right.
which makes people susceptible to financial quackery in a way they might not be for, say, weather forecasting quackery.
Yeah, nobody pays for a system claiming to predict tomorrow's weather with 99% accuracy, but they'll pay for one claiming to do it for the stock market. It's that allure of easy riches.
This whole deep dive has really underscored the profound human side of money. It's just so much more than numbers and charts.
Absolutely. Behavior, psychology, history, luck. It's all mixed in.
So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways? If someone listening could only remember a few core lessons from everything we've discussed, what should they be?
Okay, let's try to distill it down. Based on the sources, here are some actionable insights.
Yeah.
First, really go out of your way to find humility when things are going right for you, and find forgiveness or compassion for yourself and others when things go wrong. It's rarely as good or as bad as it looks in the moment. Luck plays a huge role.
Less ego, more humility. Got it.
Second, less ego also means more wealth. Remember, wealth is the income you don't spend. It's created by suppressing the desire to buy stuff today in order to have more options and security tomorrow.
Wealth is hidden.
What else? Become okay with a lot of things going wrong. Seriously, in investing in business, a small minority of things account for the vast majority of the positive outcomes. Focus on your overall portfolio's performance, not obsessing over every individual investment.
Yeah.
Don't sweat the small losses if the big picture is working.
Embrace the power of tails.
Use money to gain control over your time. That is its highest dividend. Independence and autonomy are worth more than any status symbol.
Control over time, crucial.
Be nicer and less flashy. No one is as impressed with your possessions as you are. Humility, kindness, and empathy will bring you more respect in the long run.
Good life advice generally.
Totally. Save. Just save. Even without a specific goal, think of it as a hedge against life's inevitable surprises. It buys you resilience.
Save for the sake of saving.
Right. Define the cost of success in investing. That often means dealing with volatility, fear, doubt, uncertainty, regret, and be ready to pay it. See these things as fees for achieving long-term growth, not fines that mean you're doing something wrong.
Volatility is the price of admission, not a fine. I like that.
Worship room for error. That gap between what could happen in a worst-case scenario and what you need to happen for your plan to work, that gap gives you endurance. And endurance is what lets compounding work its magic.
Margin of safety.
Critical. Avoid the extreme ends of financial decisions. All in on one stock, 100% cash, zero debt, max leverage. Your goals and circumstances will change over time, and extreme positions taken in the past often lead to regret later.
Balance and moderation.
Like risk. You need to take some risk to grow, but be absolutely paranoid about ruinous risk. Never take a risk that could wipe you out completely financially or reputationally. Survival is paramount.
Distinguish between acceptable risk and ruinous risk.
Okay, define the game you are playing. Know your own time horizon, your own risk tolerance, your own goals. Don't be swayed by people online or next door who are playing a completely different game with different rules.
Stay in your lane. Makes sense.
And finally, just respect the mess. Acknowledge that there's often no single right answer in finance that applies to everyone. It's full of complexity and nuance. Find what works for you, what's reasonable for you, and what lets you sleep at night.
Respect the mess. I love that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, too, how often what people advise others to do with money is different from what they actually do themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Hypocrisy runs rampant.
Sandy Gottsman, a billionaire investor mentioned in the sources, apparently used to ask potential hires a simple but profound question. What do you own and why?
Not about market forecasts, but about their personal skin in the game, their own philosophy in action.
Exactly. It cuts through the BS. So what about the author of our main source? What do they own? What's their personal approach? Their confession?
Yeah, they share that, which is great for transparency. Their ultimate goal isn't maximizing returns, it's independence, doing what they want, when they want, with who they want, on their own terms.
So control over time again. How do they pursue that?
Primarily through a very high savings rate. They basically decided to keep their lifestyle expenses roughly where they were in their 20s, even as their income grew. They consciously tried to get the goalposts of lifestyle desires to stop moving. So almost every raise just went straight into savings and investment.
Wow, that takes serious discipline resisting lifestyle creep.
It really does. And related to independence for homeownership, they chose to pay off their mortgage completely.
Even though mathematically, maybe keeping the mortgage and investing the difference could yield higher returns.
Exactly. On paper, paying off a low-rate mortgage might seem irrational or defenseless financially. But for them, the psychological benefit, the feeling of independence from eliminating that monthly payment outweighed the potential extra return. They prioritize being happy over being technically right.
Reasonable over rational again.
Precisely. They also keep a surprisingly large percentage of their assets in cash, maybe around 20%, outside their home equity.
20% in cash. That seems really high. Why?
Again, for independence and resilience. It prevents them from ever being forced to sell their stock investments unexpectedly, maybe due to job loss, market crash, unexpected expense. That cash acts as a buffer, the oxygen of independence, letting them ride out life's curveballs and allowing their long-term investments to compound uninterrupted.
So the cash isn't for return, it's for staying power.
Exactly. And finally, their actual investing strategy has evolved. They used to do individual stock picking.
And now?
Now they primarily use low-cost index funds. They concluded that trying to beat the market is extremely difficult and time-consuming, so they focus on what they can control. Their high savings rate, their patience, and maintaining long-term optimism about general global economic growth, which index funds capture. They rely on those factors rather than stock-picking skill for long-term success.
What a compelling set of insights. It really drives home how personal finance is. Well, more personal than finance, maybe.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's so deeply intertwined with our behavior, our emotions, our history, our unique goals.
It's clear that so much of financial success really does boil down to behavior, to emotional control, and understanding your own path, your own game.
It truly does. You know, there's that great Sherlock Holmes quote, "The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes."
What's the connection?
Well, maybe some of these financial truths, the importance of saving, the power of time, the danger of ego, are kind of obvious once stated, but we often overlook them in our own lives because of our ingrained behaviors, our biases, the stories we tell ourselves. So hopefully this deep dive encourages you, the listener, to maybe take a fresh look and consider what obvious financial truths you might be overlooking right now.
A great thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology of money. Until next time, keep digging.